It began with a frantic 911 call on the cold evening of March 14, 2023 in the quiet wooded town of Shadewood, or Andrea Moran, a distressed 16-year-old girl, sobbed as she told the operator that her best friend, 17-year-old Kelly Thorne, was missing. Kelly had been at Andrea's house just hours earlier, helping her study for a history exam before heading home. But when her parents called to check in later that night, Kelly hadn't arrived. She wasn't answering her phone, and her car was still parked outside Andrea's house. Andrea's panic was palpable. Something was terribly wrong. The Shadewood police sprang into action, initiating a search for the teenager. By dawn the next morning, the investigation took a grim turn. Officers responding to a tip about an abandoned vehicle discovered a rusted, weather-worn Ford Econoline van parked at the edge of Blackthorn Park, a remote area known for its dense forest and winding trails. Inside the van, detectives made a discovery that would haunt them for years to come. The lifeless body of Kelly Thorne curled up in the back seat. The scene was unsettling. Kelly's blonde hair was matted with dirt. Her clothes were disheveled and faint bruises marked her wrists. A tattered plaid blanket lay crumpled near her, along with a rag that bore traces of chloroform. The police immediately cordoned off the area, marking the van as the epicenter of what would become one of Shadewood's most infamous cases. The van itself held its own story, a vehicle long associated with Dylan Everly, Andrea Moran's 42-year-old stepfather. Dylan was a quiet man known around town for his work as a handyman. To outsiders, he appeared to be nothing more than a hard-working family man married to Andrea's mother, Melissa, for the past 3 years. But Dylan's calm demeanor belied a dark and twisted secret that had been lurking in the shadows for years. When detectives brought Dylan in for questioning, he initially denied everything. He claimed he hadn't touched his van in weeks and had no idea how Kelly could have ended up there, but the evidence told a different story. Traces of Kelly's DNA were found in the van alongside Dylan's fingerprints. It wasn't long before Andrea, trembling with fear, shared her own chilling confession. Her stepfather had been preying on her for years. What began as a missing persons case quickly spiraled into a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and abuse. And when Dylan finally broke under the weight of the investigation, his confession revealed horrors that no one could have anticipated. He had lured Kelly into the van that night under the pretense of helping her with a school project. What followed was a chain of events that led to her tragic death. This case would go on to shock the town of Shadewood and make national headlines, not just because of the heinous crimes committed, but because of the courage of a teenage girl who dared to expose the monster in her family. In this episode, we'll unravel the details of what happened that night in the van. The years of abuse that went unnoticed and the painstaking work of detectives who brought Dylan Everly to justice. How did this seemingly ordinary man hide such dark secrets for so long? What led him to finally confess to his crimes? And how did the community recover from such a devastating betrayal? This is the story of Dylan Everly, a man who shattered the lives of those closest to him, and the brave survivors who refused to let his crimes go unpunished. It's wonderful to see you here. The night was eerily quiet as Detective Sarah Mendel drove her unmarked car down the dirt RD, leading to Blackthorn Park. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a stretch of towering pines and damp gravel. It was just after 3 a.m. and she had been called to investigate a suspicious vehicle parked at the edge of the park, a place locals knew to avoid after dark. A hiker had reported the van earlier that evening, claiming it had been sitting there for hours with no sign of its owner. Under normal circumstances, it might have been dismissed as a forgotten vehicle, but the missing persons report filed for 17-year-old Kelly Thorne earlier that night had turned it into a top priority. Detective Mendel parked her car and stepped out into the cold March air, her breath visible in the moonlight. The scene was unsettling. The van, an aging Ford Econoline, was positioned just off the gravel trail, its tires sinking slightly into the muddy earth. The windshield was fogged over and the back windows were covered with makeshift curtains, giving the vehicle an ominous air of secrecy. As she approached, Mendel noted that the van's exterior told a story of neglect. Rust streaked the faded green paint, and the license plate was barely legible beneath a layer of dirt. A crowbar rested on the ground nearby, partially buried in the leaves. She motioned for the 2 patrol officers on the scene to stay back as she shone her flashlight into the driver's side window. What she saw made her stomach tighten, a pale hand dangling limply from the back seat. "Get the crime scene unit here now," Mendel ordered, her voice steady but urgent. She reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it creaked open without resistance. The smell hit her first, a sickening combination of chemicals and decay. Inside the van, she found the body of Kelly Thorne. The teenager was curled in the fetal position on the floor, her head resting on a plaid blanket that had been hastily thrown beneath her. Her eyes were closed, and her face was strangely peaceful, as though she were merely asleep. But the discoloration around her neck and wrists told another story. Next to Kelly's body was a small pile of items that seemed out of place. A notebook with doodles on the cover, a tube of lipstick, and a stained rag that reeked of chloroform. Mendel noted the details carefully, knowing each one could hold a clue to what had happened. The forensic team arrived within the hour, setting up floodlights and cordoning off the area with yellow tape. As they began their meticulous work, Mendel stepped back to survey the scene. The van itself was like a time capsule filled with forgotten tools, empty fast food containers, and a few crumpled receipts. It didn't take long for her to spot the van's registration in the glove compartment. The vehicle belonged to Dylan Everly, a name she didn't recognize. By sunrise, the scene had been processed and Kelly's body had been carefully removed. Early findings suggested she had been deceased for several hours before being discovered, but the exact cause of death remained unclear. Mendel was determined to find out. Her first step was tracing the van's ownership. A quick background check revealed that Dylan Everly, 42, was a handyman who lived just 15 minutes from the park. He had no prior criminal record and had been married to Melissa Moran for 3 years. The connection to Kelly wasn't immediately obvious, but Mendel couldn't ignore the proximity to Andrea Moran, Dylan's 16-year-old stepdaughter, who had been the last person to see Kelly alive. As Mendel made her way to the Moran home later that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be anything but straightforward. The details were already piling up. The isolated location, the presence of chloroform, and the van registered to someone so close to the victim. Still, it wasn't until she knocked on the Moran's front door and saw Andrea's tear-streaked face that she realized the full extent of the nightmare she was about to unravel. Kelly Thorne was the kind of girl everyone admired. A junior at Shadewood High School, she had an infectious laugh and a knack for making people feel seen. Her love of painting was well known in the small town. Her canvases, filled with bold colors and abstract designs, had been displayed at a local art fair just weeks earlier. She was popular, but not in a way that alienated others. Friends described her as genuine, the kind of person who remembered the small things like your favorite snack or how you were feeling about an upcoming test. But it was her friendship with Andrea Moran that seemed unshakable. The two had been inseparable since Andrea moved to Shadewood 3 years ago with her mother, Melissa, and her new stepfather, Dylan Everly. They bonded over shared interests in music and movies and quickly became each other's safe haven. Andrea, quieter and more reserved than Kelly, often said her friend brought color into her life, both literally and figuratively. The night Kelly went missing had been unremarkable, at least at first. According to Andrea, Kelly had come over after school to help her cram for a history test. They ordered pizza, listened to music, and spent most of the evening laughing over their inability to memorize dates from the American Revolution. Around 9 p.m., Kelly announced she had to head home. She hugged Andrea goodbye, grabbed her coat, and walked out the front door. That was the last time Andrea saw her alive. When Kelly didn't show up at home, her parents immediately began calling her cell phone, but their calls went unanswered. Her father, who worked as a truck driver, had just returned from a long-haul trip and was frantic. Kelly was always responsible and never missed curfew. By midnight, her parents had driven to Andrea's house, hoping she had stayed there longer than planned. Melissa Moran answered the door, explaining that Kelly had left hours ago. Andrea joined the search, calling friends and driving around town, but Kelly was nowhere to be found. By the time the police discovered Kelly's body in Dylan Everly's van, Andrea and her mother were already in shock from the news of her disappearance. When Detective Mendel arrived at the Moran home later that morning, the air was thick with tension. Andrea sat on the living room couch, clutching her phone as if waiting for Kelly to text her back. Melissa, pale and visibly shaken, hovered nearby, answering Mendel's questions with trembling hands. It was during this conversation that Dylan Everly entered the room. He looked tired, his graying hair disheveled and his flannel shirt wrinkled, but his demeanor was calm. He shook Detective Mendel's hand firmly, introducing himself in a deep, measured voice. "Anything I can do to help," he said. But Mendel noticed the way his eyes darted toward Andrea and the subtle stiffness in his posture. Dylan's initial answers were straightforward. He claimed he had spent the previous evening in the garage, fixing a broken shelf, and had gone to bed early. He insisted he hadn't touched his van in weeks and seemed genuinely surprised when Mendel informed him that it had been found with a body inside. "That's impossible," he said, his voice tightening. "Who would take my van? It's old. It barely runs." But Mendel's instincts told her there was more to Dylan's story. As she questioned him further, his responses became clipped. He couldn't explain why his van was parked at Blackthorn Park or how it might have been stolen without his knowledge. When asked if he knew Kelly, he paused for a fraction too long before saying she was Andrea's friend. "I didn't know her well." Meanwhile, Mendel noticed Andrea growing increasingly agitated. She avoided eye contact with her stepfather, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. When Mendel asked her if she could think of anyone who might want to hurt Kelly, Andrea hesitated before shaking her head. But her voice cracked as she said she never hurt anyone. Everyone loved her. Over the next few hours, Mendel's team began piecing together the connections between Dylan, Andrea, and Kelly. A search of Kelly's social media revealed that she had frequently tagged Andrea in posts about sleepovers and late-night adventures. But Dylan was notably absent from any of their conversations. However, Andrea's demeanor around him raised red flags for Mendel. The tension in the room wasn't just the result of grief, it was something deeper. Back at the station, detectives began digging into Dylan's background. He had no criminal record, no prior arrests, and no complaints filed against him. By all outward appearances, he was an average middle-aged man, a handyman who lived a quiet life. But the discovery of Kelly's DNA and fingerprints in his van suggested otherwise. As the investigation continued, Kelly's parents provided more insight into her life. Her father, Robert Thorne, described her as an ambitious teenager with big dreams of attending art school. She wanted to make people feel something with her work, he said, his voice breaking. She had so much ahead of her. Her mother, Beth, was more direct. "Someone took her from us. And I won't rest until we find out who." By the end of the day, Detective Mendel had two clear priorities: to find out how Kelly ended up in Dylan Everly's van and to uncover the secrets Andrea Moran seemed too afraid to share. By the time Dylan Everly was brought in for his first formal police interview, Detective Sarah Mendel was already forming a theory. The evidence was mounting. The van where Kelly's body had been discovered belonged to Dylan. And forensic analysis confirmed his fingerprints on both the driver's seat and the rag soaked in chloroform. While the details didn't paint a full picture yet, Mendel knew there was one person in this case who wasn't being entirely honest. Dylan, however, remained calm as he sat across from Mendel in the small, sparsely furnished interview room. His demeanor was casual, almost too casual. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped on the table, and answered the detective's questions with an air of practiced detachment. "I already told you," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I didn't even know the van was gone until you showed up at my house. Someone must have stolen it." Mendel, unfazed, pressed him further. "So you're saying the last time you used the van was when?" Dylan hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. Maybe a month ago. I don't drive it much. It's mostly for work, and I haven't had any big jobs recently." Mendel didn't flinch as she slid a photo of the crime scene across the table. The image showed the back of the van, with Kelly's body partially visible under the plaid blanket. "Do you recognize this blanket?" Dylan stared at the photo for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, that's from the van. I use it for camping sometimes." "So a blanket from your van was found covering a teenage girl's body. And you're telling me you don't know how it got there?" Mendel's tone was sharp, her words precise. Dylan's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I told you, someone must have taken the van. Maybe it was some sicko who knew me or something." Despite his calm facade, Mendel noted subtle cracks in his demeanor. He avoided her gaze, fidgeted with the cuff of his flannel shirt, and spoke in clipped sentences when pressed. His explanation for the van's disappearance was vague at best, and Mendel could tell he was trying to distance himself from the crime. Meanwhile, the forensic team was working tirelessly to fill in the gaps. The initial analysis of the van provided more than enough reason to keep Dylan under scrutiny. Kelly's fingerprints were found on the passenger side door, suggesting she had been inside the vehicle willingly, at least at first. Even more damning was the discovery of Dylan's fingerprints not only on the chloroform-soaked rag, but also on the interior of the back door, where scratches and scuff marks hinted at a struggle. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that raised alarm bells. As detectives interviewed those close to the Moran household, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Andrea Moran, though visibly shaken during her initial interview, had let slip a detail that stuck in Mendel's mind. She had always hated riding in her stepfather's van. At first, the comment seemed inconsequential, but when Mendel followed up with Andrea, the teenager's discomfort became more apparent. "I don't know, it's just weird," Andrea said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He always wanted to take me places in the van, even when we didn't need to." Mendel pressed gently, sensing Andrea was holding back. "What kinds of places, Andrea? Did anything ever happen during those rides?" Andrea's eyes welled up with tears, and she shook her head quickly, as if trying to banish the thought. "I don't know. I don't want to talk about it." Andrea's reluctance to elaborate only added to Mendel's suspicions, but she didn't push further. Not yet. Instead, she focused on tracing Dylan's movements on the night of Kelly's disappearance. Surveillance footage from a gas station just a mile from Blackthorn Park provided a breakthrough. The grainy video showed Dylan's van pulling into the parking lot at p.m., roughly an hour after Kelly was last seen leaving Andrea's house. Though the footage didn't clearly show who was driving, it was enough to place the van in the vicinity of the crime scene. Confronted with this new evidence, Dylan's composure began to waver when Mendel brought up the surveillance footage during their second interview. His response was defensive and erratic. "So what?" he snapped. "That doesn't prove I was driving. Anyone could have taken the van." "Anyone," Mendel countered, her voice calm but firm. "Dylan, let me tell you what we know so far. Your van was at Blackthorn Park. Inside, we found a blanket you own, your fingerprints and a chemical-soaked rag you touched. Kelly's body was in the back, and we've got surveillance footage putting the van in the area at the time of her death. That's a lot of coincidences, don't you think?" Dylan glared at her, his fists clenching on the table. For a moment, Mendel thought he might lash out, but instead he leaned back and exhaled sharply. "I'm being set up," he muttered. "I don't know how, but someone's trying to ruin me." Despite his protests, Dylan's lies were beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The more detectives investigated, the more cracks they found in his story. Receipts found in the van dated from the day before Kelly's disappearance suggested Dylan had recently been inside, directly contradicting his claim that he hadn't used it in weeks. Furthermore, fibers matching the plaid blanket were found on Dylan's clothing during a search of the Moran home. But it was Andrea who would deliver the most chilling revelation of all. Late one evening, after days of interviews and mounting pressure, the teenager finally broke down. Tears streaming down her face, she confessed that her stepfather had been abusing her for years. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared. He always said no one would believe me." Andrea's testimony, though deeply disturbing, provided detectives with a clearer picture of Dylan's character and his predatory tendencies. It was becoming increasingly clear that Kelly's death wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of abuse and manipulation. For Mendel, the pieces were falling into place, but the full story of what had happened that night and how it had ended so tragically was still waiting to be uncovered. As detectives continued to probe into Dylan Everly's life, the disturbing patterns they uncovered painted a chilling portrait of a man who had skillfully concealed his predatory nature for years. What had initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy was quickly revealing itself as a web of manipulation, abuse, and betrayal that stretched far beyond the night Kelly Thorne lost her life. One of the key breakthroughs came from Andrea Moran, Dylan's 16-year-old stepdaughter. Andrea, initially reluctant to speak out, was now beginning to share fragments of her life with detectives, fragments that hinted at years of trauma. "He always made me feel like I owed him something," Andrea admitted during her second interview. Her voice cracked as she described how Dylan had ingratiated himself into her life after marrying her mother, Melissa. "At first, he seemed like he wanted to be my friend," Andrea said. "He would buy me things. Little gifts like snacks or books I liked. He'd always tell me I was special, that I deserved more attention than my mom gave me. Andrea paused, wiping away tears. But then he started crossing lines. Andrea's revelations were corroborated by her friends, who shared that Andrea had often expressed discomfort around Dylan. One friend recalled how Andrea had once confessed to feeling trapped in her own home. She said he was always around. Always watching, the friend told detectives. She hated being alone with him. Detectives also discovered a pattern in Dylan's behavior that centered around his van. It wasn't just a work vehicle, it was his private space, a makeshift hideout he used to isolate his victims. Andrea confirmed that Dylan would often insist on taking her for errands or drives in the van. He said it was our bonding time, Andrea explained, her voice filled with disgust. But it never felt right. He'd lock the doors, and sometimes he'd just sit there and talk about weird stuff, like how no one understood him except me. Forensic evidence from the van added another layer to the investigation. Hidden beneath the carpeted floor, detectives discovered a small compartment containing rope, duct tape, and a roll of plastic sheeting. While the items alone didn't prove anything, their presence in the vehicle raised significant concerns. This wasn't just a van, Detective Sarah Mendel remarked to her team. It was a predator's lair. As the investigation deepened, Melissa Moran, Andrea's mother, began to grapple with her own suspicions. Melissa had always believed Dylan to be a kind and dependable husband. He had stepped into her life at a time when she was struggling after her divorce from Andrea's father and had provided stability for her and her daughter, but now confronted with the mounting evidence. Melissa was forced to reevaluate everything. "I should have seen it," Melissa told detectives during an emotional interview. "There were signs, but I ignored them. Andrea didn't like being around him, but I thought it was just teenage stuff. She'd always complain when he offered to drive her places, and I didn't think much of it. I didn't want to believe he was capable of anything like this." Melissa's testimony added critical context to the investigation. She revealed that Dylan had a controlling streak, often dictating how she and Andrea spent their time. "He didn't like it when Andrea went out with her friends too much," Melissa said. "He'd make up excuses to keep her home, like saying it wasn't safe or that she needed to spend more time with family. I thought he was just being protective." While Melissa's guilt was palpable, Andrea's bravery in sharing her story opened the floodgates for more damning revelations. Investigators discovered a journal Andrea had kept hidden in her room, filled with entries that detailed her stepfather's escalating behavior. One entry, dated 6 months before Kelly's death, read, "He keeps asking me to go for drives in the van. I hate it. I don't know how to say no without making him mad. He always says I'm his favorite. It makes my skin crawl." The journal also contained references to Kelly. In one entry, Andrea wrote about how Dylan would sometimes comment on Kelly's appearance. "He says things about her like he's complimenting her, but it doesn't feel right. I told Kelly to stay away from him, but I don't think she takes me seriously." Detectives also uncovered another chilling piece of evidence. Kelly's diary. Her parents had handed it over to the police, hoping it might provide answers about what had happened to their daughter. The entries were cryptic at first, teenage musings about school, friendships, and her dreams of becoming an artist. But as detectives read further, they found a series of increasingly anxious passages. One entry, written just a week before her death, stood out. "Something about Mr. Everly creeps me out. He's always asking me questions about Andrea, like what we do together or where we go. Last week, he asked if I wanted a ride home from school. I said no, but it was weird. Andrea says he's harmless, but I don't know. I feel like he's always watching us." The entries provided a chilling glimpse into the fear Kelly had been experiencing in the weeks leading up to her death. They also confirmed that Dylan had been fixated on Kelly, despite his earlier claims that he barely knew her. Combined with Andrea's testimony, the journals painted a picture of a predator whose behavior had escalated over time. As the investigation continued, detectives began to piece together a timeline of Dylan's actions on the night of Kelly's disappearance. Surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and witness statements all pointed to a calculated plan. Dylan had waited for Kelly to leave Andrea's house that evening, knowing she would be walking alone to her car. He had lured her into his van under the pretense of needing help with something, a ruse he had likely used before. What happened next would remain the subject of speculation until Dylan's eventual confession. For Detective Mendel, the case was becoming increasingly clear, but it was also deeply unsettling. This wasn't just about one crime, she told her team. This was about years of unchecked abuse and manipulation. Dylan Everly didn't just destroy one life. He shattered an entire family and possibly more than we even know. But even as the pieces began to fall into place, Mendel knew there was still work to be done. The evidence was strong, but Dylan had yet to fully confess. And with each new revelation, the question remained, how many more secrets was he hiding? Let's take a quick break to chat. What are your thoughts on the case we're diving into today? If you're enjoying the story, leave a 1 in the comments. If it didn't resonate with you, drop a 0. I'd love to hear your insights, so share them below. Thank you for sticking around. Your support means the world and helps me bring you new content every day. It was late in the evening when Detective Sarah Mendel decided to make one last push with Dylan Everly. After days of questioning and mounting evidence, Dylan had remained defiant, clinging to his claims of innocence. But Mendel had seen this before. The gradual erosion of a suspect's confidence as the weight of the truth pressed down on them. She could sense that Dylan was close to breaking, and she was determined to make it happen. Sitting across from Dylan in the dimly lit interrogation room, Mendel laid out the evidence once more, this time with the Escondria edge. "Dylan," she began, her tone calm but firm. "We've been patient with you. We've given you every opportunity to explain yourself, but here's the reality. The evidence doesn't lie. Your fingerprints are all over that van, all over the rags soaked in chloroform. Kelly's DNA is there too. And now we have surveillance footage placing your van near Blackthorn Park the night she disappeared. This isn't going away." Dylan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. For the first time, his previously steady demeanor cracked, and Mendel caught a glimpse of the fear behind his defiance. "I told you," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't do anything to her." Mendel leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Then explain it to me. Explain how a teenage girl ended up dead in your van. Explain why your stepdaughter is terrified of you. Explain why Kelly's diary describes you as someone she didn't trust. If you're innocent, Dylan, now is the time to tell me your side of the story. Because right now, the story we have doesn't look good for you." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Dylan's eyes darted to the door as though he were searching for an escape route. Then he slumped forward, his elbows on the table, and exhaled a long, shaky breath. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Mendel didn't react, didn't let him see the small victory she felt in that moment. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Dylan?" she asked softly. "Tell me what happened that night." Dylan hesitated, running his hands through his disheveled hair. When he finally spoke, his words were slow and deliberate, as though he were piecing together the story for the first time. "Kelly. She was a good kid," he began. "She reminded me of Andrea. They were always together, always laughing. I wanted to talk to her." "Talk to her about what?" Mendel pressed her voice steady. "I don't know." Dylan snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She was just so full of life, always so confident. I thought maybe she could help me understand Andrea better. That's all." Mendel didn't let him off the hook. "So you lured her into your van. What did you say to her?" Dylan's face reddened, and he looked away. I told her I needed help with something. She trusted me. Why wouldn't she? I'm her best friend's stepdad." The confession came slowly at first, like water dripping from a faulty faucet. Dylan admitted to picking Kelly up near Andrea's house that night, under the pretense of needing help moving something heavy from the van. "She didn't want to at first," he said, his voice trembling. "But I convinced her. I told her it'd only take a minute." When Mendel asked what happened next, Dylan hesitated again, his breathing shallow. "She got into the van," he said. "Finally. I didn't mean for it to go the way it did. I just wanted to talk to her, but she got scared. She said she wanted to leave, But I panicked. Panicked. Mendel repeated, her tone sharp. What did you do, Dylan? I tried to calm her down, he exclaimed, his voice rising. I told her it was okay, but she wouldn't listen. She started screaming and he stopped mid-sentence, his head dropping into his hands. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to stop yelling. It was a partial confession, but it was enough to confirm what detectives had suspected all along. Dylan admitted to using chloroform to subdue Kelly, claiming he had purchased it weeks earlier, just in case Andrea ever had an anxiety attack. Mendel knew the excuse was absurd, but she let him continue. She passed out, Dylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought she'd wake up, but she didn't. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I drove to the park and left her there. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Mendel sat back, her expression neutral, despite the anger boiling beneath the surface. So you're telling me her death was an accident, that you didn't mean to hurt her? Yes, Dylan cried, tears streaming down his face. I swear I didn't mean to kill her, but Mendel wasn't buying it. She knew from experience that predators like Dylan often tried to minimize their actions, framing their crimes as mistakes or misunderstandings, and the evidence told a different story. The scratches on the van's interior, the duct tape found beneath the floorboards, the chloroform. These weren't the tools of an innocent man who had panicked. They were the tools of a predator who had planned for this moment. As Dylan's sobs filled the room, Mendel turned to the officer standing by the door. We've heard enough, she said, her voice cold. Take him back to his cell. The confession was a critical breakthrough, but it wasn't the end of the investigation. Mendel knew they still had to piece together the full story of Dylan's actions that night, as well as his history of abuse. Andrea's testimony, Kelly's diary, and the forensic evidence would play crucial roles in building the case against him. But for now, Mendel allowed herself a small moment of relief. After days of lies and half-truths, Dylan Everly had finally begun to unravel. Still, as she left the interrogation room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Secrets that would shed light on just how far Dylan's darkness truly went. The confession was a critical step forward, but it was far from the end of the case. For Detective Sarah Mendel and her team, the work was only beginning. Dylan Everly's claim that Kelly's death had been an accident didn't align with the mounting evidence, and Mendel was determined to expose the full extent of his crimes. The forensic analysis of Dylan's van became a treasure trove of information. The scratches on the interior walls matched patterns consistent with someone desperately struggling to escape. Fibers from Kelly's clothing were found in multiple areas of the van, including the back seat where her body had been discovered. Detectives also recovered hair samples from another individual, Andrea Moran, confirming suspicions that Dylan had used the van for his abusive activities long before Kelly's death. Further testing on the chloroform-soaked rag revealed a chilling detail. It wasn't a makeshift decision. The rag had been prepared and stored in a sealed plastic bag, indicating premeditation. This wasn't panic, Mendel said during a team briefing. This was a calculated plan. He knew exactly what he was doing, but the most damning piece of evidence came in the form of Kelly's own voice. Among her belongings, detectives found her cell phone, which had been partially damaged but still contained a trove of data. Forensic technicians recovered an audio recording from the night of her disappearance, a file that Kelly had started during her encounter with Dylan. The recording captured her panicked voice as she repeatedly told him to let her go, followed by his chilling reply. You just need to relax. Everything's going to be fine. The recording ended abruptly, but its contents left no doubt about Dylan's intentions. As news of the case spread, the small town of Shadewood was rocked to its core. Dylan had been known as a quiet, dependable handyman, someone who fixed fences and repaired roofs for half the neighborhood. The idea that such a seemingly ordinary man could harbor such darkness was almost too much to process. Parents began questioning their own judgment, wondering how they had missed the signs. Teachers at Shadewood High School held assemblies to counsel students, many of whom were grappling with the loss of a classmate and the horrifying details surrounding her death. For Andrea Moran, the aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions on one hand. She felt relief that Dylan was finally out of her life and that his crimes were coming to light. On the other hand, she was consumed by guilt and shame, wondering if she could have done more to prevent what happened to Kelly. She struggled to balance her grief with her newfound role as a key witness in the case. With the support of her mother, Melissa, and a counselor assigned by the police, Andrea began to piece together the fragments of her life. Though the road ahead was anything but easy, detectives also uncovered more victims. 2 young women in their 20s came forward, claiming that Dylan had behaved inappropriately through a tour them years earlier when they hired him to do odd jobs around their homes. Though neither woman had pursued charges at the time, their testimonies revealed a pattern of escalating behavior. Dylan's predatory tendencies had been hiding in plain sight for years. Shielded by his unassuming demeanor, as the investigation progressed, the prosecution worked tirelessly to build an airtight case. Assistant District Attorney Valerie Cruz took the lead, determined to ensure that Dylan Everly would never hurt anyone again. "This isn't just about Kelly," Cruz told the press. "This is about every person he manipulated, every life he damaged. We're going to make sure justice is served." The trial of Dylan Everly began 6 months after Kelly Thorne's death and quickly became the most closely watched case in Shadewood's history. Courtroom 4C was packed every day of the proceedings, with journalists and community members vying for seats. The prosecution painted a damning portrait of Dylan, a manipulative predator who had spent years grooming his stepdaughter and escalating his behavior until it culminated in the tragic death of Kelly. Assistant District Attorney Valerie Cruz's opening statement was a masterclass in persuasion. She began by holding up a photograph of Kelly, smiling, vibrant and full of life, and contrasted it with the haunting image of her body as it was found in Dylan's van. "This is not a case of an accident," Cruz said firmly, her voice resonating through the courtroom. "This is a case of a man who preyed on the vulnerable, who used trust as his weapon, and who ultimately took the life of a young girl who deserved so much more." The prosecution wasted no time presenting their evidence. They began with the forensic findings, laying out a meticulous timeline of events. Each detail, Kelly's fingerprints on the passenger side door, the scratches inside the van, the prepared chloroform rag, was presented with clarity and precision. Experts testified about the chemical compounds in the chloroform. Explaining how its use indicated premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment decision, the recording recovered from Kelly's phone was played in court, leaving the jury visibly shaken as they heard her pleas for freedom. Andrea Moran's testimony became the emotional cornerstone of the trial. Standing in front of the courtroom, the teenager described the years of abuse she had endured at the hands of her stepfather. "He always acted like he was doing me a favor," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "But I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to stop it." Andrea's bravery was met with overwhelming support, but her testimony also revealed the depth of Dylan's manipulation. She recounted how he had used fear and guilt to keep her silent, making her feel complicit in his actions. "He told me no one would believe me," she said, "and for a long time I believed him." The defense attempted to argue that Kelly's death was an accident, emphasizing Dylan's confession and claiming that he had panicked after she passed out. But this argument was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, who pointed to the evidence of premeditation. "This was not the act of a man who panicked," Cruz argued in her closing statement. "This was the act of a man who planned, who calculated, and who believed he could get away with it." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault, and child endangerment. Dylan Everly sat expressionless as the verdict was read, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. For the families of Kelly and Andrea, the verdict brought a sense of closure, though the scars of Dylan's actions would linger for years to come. At the sentencing hearing, Kelly's parents addressed the court, their voices trembling with emotion. "Kelly was our light," her father said. "She was taken from us in the most horrific way, and nothing will ever fill the hole she left behind. But today we have justice." When it was Andrea's turn to speak, she faced her stepfather with a strength that had taken months to build. "You tried to break me," she said, her voice firm. "But you didn't, and now you'll never hurt anyone else." Dylan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs, a mixture of relief and sorrow hanging in the air. For Detective Mendel, it was the culmination of months of tireless work, a victory tempered by the knowledge of all the pain Dylan had caused. In the weeks following the trial, Andrea and Melissa began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Andrea became an advocate for survivors of abuse, using her story to inspire others to speak out. "I won't let him define me," she told a local reporter. "I'm more than what he did to me and Kelly. She deserves to be remembered for the amazing person she was." As for the town of Shadewood, the case served as a sobering reminder that monsters often hide in plain sight. But it also became a story of resilience, of a community coming together to ensure that justice was served. And that Kelly's light would never be forgotten. The courtroom was silent as Judge Ellen Brooks prepared to deliver Dylan Everly's sentence. The jury had found him guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault, and child endangerment. And now the weight of his crimes would finally be met with the justice they deserved. Seated at the front, Kelly Thorne's parents clutched one another's hands, their faces a mixture of grief and relief. Nearby, Andrea Moran sat with her mother, Melissa, her expression unreadable, but her resolve clear. This moment wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming control over their lives. Judge Brooks began her statement by addressing the gravity of Dylan's actions. "Mr. Everly, you preyed on the trust of those closest to you. You manipulated, deceived, and inflicted unimaginable harm on people who should have been able to count on you for safety and love. Your actions have shattered lives, and the pain you have caused is immeasurable." The courtroom listened intently as the judge outlined the impact of Dylan's crimes. She referenced the testimony of Andrea Moran, whose bravery had been instrumental in exposing her stepfather's years of abuse, and the forensic evidence that painted a clear picture of a predator who had meticulously planned his crimes. She also acknowledged the profound loss felt by Kelly Thorne's family, whose lives would never be the same. Before delivering the sentence, the judge allowed victim impact statements to be read. Kelly's father, Robert Thorne, stood first, his voice trembling with emotion as he addressed the court. "Kelly was our joy, our pride," he said. "She had so much ahead of her, a life full of potential that was stolen by this man. Nothing can bring her back, but we hope this sentence ensures no other family has to endure what we have." Andrea Moran also took the stand, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. She stared directly at Dylan as she spoke. "You tried to silence me for years to make me feel small and powerless, but I'm standing here today because I refuse to let you define me. What you did to me, to Kelly, it doesn't end with you. I'm going to make sure that others know they're not alone, that they can speak out and be believed. You don't get to control me anymore." When it came time for sentencing, Judge Brooks did not hesitate. Dylan Everly was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Kelly Thorne, with additional sentences for the sexual assault and abuse charges to run consecutively. The decision ensured that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As Dylan was led away in handcuffs, he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. For the first time during the entire trial, he appeared small, diminished, stripped of the control he had wielded for so long. For Kelly's family, Andrea, and the community of Shadewood, it was a moment of bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, but the scars of Dylan's actions would linger for years to come. In the weeks and months following Dylan Everly's conviction, the town of Shadewood began the slow process of healing. For many, the case had shattered the illusion of safety that came with living in a small, close-knit community. People who had once trusted Dylan, neighbors who had hired him to fix their fences, teachers who had waved to him during school pickups, were left questioning how they could have missed the warning signs. Detective Sarah Mendel reflected on the case often. As a seasoned investigator, she had seen her share of darkness. But Dylan's crimes were a reminder of how predators often blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. He wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows, she told a local news outlet. He was someone who wore the mask of normalcy, someone who knew how to exploit trust. Cases like this remind us that vigilance is key, and we must always listen to the voices of survivors. For Andrea Moran, the journey to healing was only just beginning. With the help of therapy and support from her mother, she began to process the years of abuse she had endured. Andrea found strength in speaking out, becoming an advocate for survivors of sexual abuse. She partnered with local organizations to raise awareness about grooming and abuse, often sharing her story at schools and community events. "If I can help even one person avoid what happened to me, then it's worth it," she said during an interview. With a regional news station, we need to create a world where people feel safe speaking up. Andrea also found ways to honor Kelly's memory. She helped organize a mural project at Shadewood High School, inviting students to paint a tribute to Kelly and other victims of abuse. The mural, which featured a bright, colorful depiction of a sunrise, quickly became a symbol of hope and resilience for the community. Beneath it, a plaque read in memory of Kelly Thorne. May her light never fade. For Melissa Moran, the revelations about her husband were a source of deep guilt. I trusted him, she admitted during an interview. I thought I was protecting my daughter by giving her a stable home, but I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. I'll carry that guilt forever, but I also know it's my job now to support Andrea and help her rebuild her life. The Thorne family, too, found solace in remembering Kelly for the vibrant, creative, and compassionate person she was. They established the Kelly Thorne Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting young artists and advocating for victims of abuse. Kelly believed in the power of art to change lives, her father said during the foundation's launch. This is our way of ensuring her spirit lives on as for the town of Shadewood. The case served as both a cautionary tale and a rallying cry for change. Community leaders introduced new programs to educate parents, teachers, and students about recognizing the signs of grooming and abuse. Local law enforcement also began working more closely with schools to create safe spaces for students to report concerns. In the end, the story of Dylan Everly wasn't just about the horrors he inflicted. It was about the strength of those who survived, the resilience of a community, and the determination to ensure that such tragedies could never happen again. For Andrea, Kelly's family, and all those affected, the road ahead would be long, but it would also be marked by hope, healing, and a renewed commitment to justice. As Andrea put it during a speech at the unveiling of the mural, we can't change what happened, but we can change what happens next. We can make sure that Kelly's story isn't just one of loss, it's one of courage, love, and the power of speaking out. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.